Hello and welcome to episode 3. My name's Day. I'm a final year medical student from UCL in London. So in this episode today, we're going to discuss a bit about why there's so much trauma. Because last episode it was quite long and I couldn't quite fit it in, but hoping to keep this episode a lot shorter and a lot more commentary over the top. So I hope you enjoy it and find it interesting. First of all, I have to say some disclaimers. Obviously, everything that I say in this video is my own opinion. It's based on the South Africans that I've spoken to, what I've read from the internet. So obviously, it's what I think is the reason, and none of this is like definitely right or definitely wrong. The second thing to say is I apologise. There's going to be a lot of shots from the side of the car. So first of all, you have your classic ingredients that you'd find anywhere, which tends to lead to social unrest. So there's a high level of unemployment, there's a high level of poverty, and also a high level of inequality, especially in Soweto, which contains some of the poorest parts of Johannesburg. Another aspect of Soweto that I think contributes is is that it really is a melting pot of a lot of migrants, both from within South Africa and also from outside of South Africa. And one thing you have to realize in South Africa is that if you're from Johannesburg, or say if you're from somewhere else like KwaZulu-Natal, the people are quite different and the culture is quite different as well. And on top of this, I was also told that here in South Africa there's actually quite a high degree of xenophobia. And so all of these things combined in a tightly packed and very densely populated area such as Soweto mean that it's not only a melting pot for culture and races, but also leads to a lot of conflict between these different cultures and races. The third thing to say, and I guess this point is one of the most important, is that there's a real lack of respect and trust and belief in the law enforcement here in South Africa. I think this stems a lot from apartheid, and apartheid is something that I want to cover in another episode at a later point. But it's essentially in apartheid, the police force were totally discriminatory and very corrupt. And so since then, how can you really see the everyday South African really trusting the police force? And even with the end of apartheid, the police force here is still seen as very corrupt and at the least very inefficient. So really, most South Africans, especially the poorer ones from Soweto, how can they really expect to get any resolution to any crimes that were committed to them? And if you don't trust the police force, then you end up having to take justice into your own hands. And this is something that happens in Soweto, where you do get mob justice and you do get people coming into Bara who've been stabbed, and then they'll say to you, "Oh, I know who stabbed me, and I'm going to go stab them once I get out of here." The fourth thing to mention, and it's probably a result of all the previous points mentioned, is that there very much is a normalization of crime out here, and definitely a normalization of violence. And I think this is partly because, as I said, there's no trust in police force, so people take justice into their own hands. But also because there's quite a high level of violence, especially towards children here, also to women. And so therefore you get people who grow up in an environment where violence is very normal. And you can see it with a lot of the patients who come into Bara who've been stabbed. You will often ask them, well, why did they stab you, or how did you get stabbed? And they'll simply say, "Oh, I was drinking, I got into an argument with this person and they just stabbed me." And that story is surprisingly common. I would say that pretty much all the patients I talk to give me that story. So you can see from that it seems to be very trivial as to why you get stabbed here. Finally, I can't do this episode without talking about the most obvious underlying cause of everything we see in Bara, and that is alcohol. And it is a big problem here, and especially on payday, like I mentioned before, when people get paid, they do tend to go out drinking. And pretty much every patient that walks into Bara will have been under the influence of alcohol when they got stabbed or when they got assaulted. One point that I guess I wanted to expand on a bit more, because I think it's a problem that has been growing across the world, and that is the issue of inequality. And I think here in South Africa it's very evident that it's a very unequal society. And I think by some international indexes, South Africa is one of the most unequal countries in the world. in terms of disparity between the richest and the poorest here. And I think this in South Africa gives you an interesting insight into what happens when you have such massive inequality. Because the poorest deal with the brunt of the increase in crime, especially the violent crime. However, everyone suffers because for the middle upper classes, you end up living quite secluded lives. You live in walled off compounds, you drive everywhere, and all the activities you do tend to be in sort of more secure places. So, for instance, we went on a trail walking, but the trail walking is in a sort of fenced off large area. So you can sort of see how everything in Johannesburg has had to be geared towards safety above everything else. And it leads to everyone here living in a bit of a state of paranoia about crime occurring. And this is just isn't healthy for anyone who's living in a country. I realise this episode may have painted South Africa in I guess quite a negative light, and I think what I have to say at the end of the video is that I absolutely love it here. I think it's a amazing country, I think, and it's such an interesting country as well, especially from a medical viewpoint. It really adds a whole new dimension to travelling when you get to experience what the healthcare is like in the country as well. Um, Next episode, I want to focus a bit on the safety in Johannesburg, because this episode is sort of alluding to it as well about safety and how you feel when you go around the city. I think quickly what I'll say is that I've never felt in danger here in South Africa, and I think it's like anywhere else in the world. You have to keep your wits about you when you're traveling, and not just that, but I said it to my mum as well, who worried quite a lot. In that there are many parts of London that I wouldn't feel safe going to at night, and I think it's the same in any city in the world. I'm sure it's the same for New York, and I'm sure it's the same for Paris as well, and I'm sure it's the same for many of these big cities. Is that you can never guarantee you'll be 100% safe, and you just apply your common sense safety, and you do get by fine. Obviously, here in South Africa, there are a few more precautions that you do take, but I wouldn't say that this has been very noticeable to me. And I think it's not something that should stop you from coming because you fear for your safety here, because it's simply not the case. I think it is actually not as bad as the reputation of it makes it out to be. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope there was something interesting to be gained from what I've been saying, and I hope you'll watch the next episode.